Okay, so we're here with a discussion of the U.S. Constitution and a few of the Federalist Papers. So I'm not going to do too much in terms of background content on these. Hopefully by now, again, you guys are all Reach Act compliant, or you should be Reach Act compliant, so you have a pretty good notion by now what the Federalist Papers are. A series of op-eds written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay in the lead up to the vote that would ratify the proposed Constitution, 1788, 1789. The four that we read for today, 47 through 51, actually five that we read for today, 47 through 51, these are all of them written by Madison. And with respect to um, views on constitutionalism, Madison was clearly the superior thinker between him and Hamilton, the two main writers of the Federalist Papers. And we're also going to take a quick look at the U.S. Constitution. To be honest, I don't have a ton to add from what I've already, or from what you've presumably already learned about these documents. I do want to provide a little bit of context that traces it back to some of the discussions that we've been having thus far. Um, and in particular, I want to enter these into our discussions as exemplary of something we touched on yesterday with our discussion of Montesquieu, uh, something that we're going to call liberal institutionalism. So we have thus far looked at two strains, as it were, within the liberal tradition. One of them is the natural rights tradition within liberalism, best represented, I think, by a figure like Locke. But maybe most dramatically and effectively realized in Jefferson's Declaration of Independence in 1776. What you find in the Constitution and what you find in the Federalist Papers that served as a kind of theoretical justification or explanation of the Constitution, you don't find a lot of the sort of the high-flying moral language of these other documents. You don't see a ton of references to natural right. You don't see a ton of references to natural equality. You don't see a ton of references really to what you might think of as sort of foundational principles. You do see a lot of references to liberty, even though what liberty is understood to be is left somewhat open-ended. And you certainly don't see any sort of careful or abstract conceptual considerations of the idea of liberty. When these guys wrote the Federalist Papers, they kind of assumed that when they talked about liberty, that people knew what they meant. They also kind of assumed that when they were talking about liberty, they didn't mean liberty in the abstract. They meant a particular conception of liberty, and that is to say, the liberty that was enjoyed by British citizens, British subjects. So freedoms of the press, freedoms of conscience, religious freedoms, freedoms and toleration. Likewise, freedoms to conduct business in the way that they saw fit, freedom to express themselves, freedom to order their households, and to move about as they saw fit. So, not liberty in the kind of abstract way that we saw in Locke, but a specific set of liberties that they had come to enjoy over the course of decades and even centuries as British subjects. Now, when we say liberal institutionalism, partly what we mean is rather than focusing on questions of legitimacy, i.e., which forms of government are legitimate, and we saw with Locke that this is only those forms which have the consent of the governed, or on which actions are legitimate, as we saw with Locke, only those actions which are in keeping with the original contract or with the laws of nature, those actions which perfect the law of nature. Rather than focus constantly on this question of legitimacy, what the liberal institutionalists do is they assume that government is necessary. They assume that government will exist. They assume that government serves some sort of permanent purpose, permanent human purpose, and that the idea of a society without government is, the idea of a cart without a horse. These things simply doesn't happen. So the question becomes, how do we make a government which is large enough, which is, to borrow a word that they like to use at the time, energetic enough to accomplish the things that we require it to accomplish, i.e., to protect property, but also to provide infrastructure, to encourage commerce, to negotiate and potentially defend its citizens against foreign invaders? How do we create a government which is efficient and effective and sufficiently energetic to accomplish these tasks, but which won't grow so large and so effective that it will threaten the very liberties that we need it to protect? Now, we saw with Montesquieu that liberty was protected, or that liberty was found in those regimes where power was made moderate, right? So if you had a moderate government, which is to say, if your government, whether it be a monarchy, whether it be an elected republic, whether it be an aristocracy, whether it be grounded in titles and land, whether it be grounded in hereditary succession, whatever it is, if that government behaves, if it acts in a moderate fashion, which is to say, if it is prevented from abusing its powers, then you will be free. So the question becomes then, how do we create an energetic government which is nonetheless not so energetic, not so unbound, that even the very best governors won't be prone to abuse its powers, won't be prone to use its powers to um, harm the life and liberty of its citizens? So the Constitution is the end result of this process. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I do want to just briefly take a look at it and highlight what I think are some of the more important elements of it. So one thing to note about the Constitution, here we are at the very, very beginning. This is page 2 of the PDF that I attached, is the so-called preamble of the document, which gives some theoretical information that may be of interest to us. So they write, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." So the most, at least with respect to our concern, the most theoretically important phrase here is this: "we the people." So to go back to our Lockean framework, the founders are not claiming that that they need everyone to consent to join this Constitution. We are not back in the state of nature. This is not a Constitution which represents a leap from the state of nature into political society and the government. Rather, what they're saying is the United States already constitutes a people. This people previously expressed its will with respect to government and organization in the so-called Articles of Confederation, and of course their various state governments. That people hereby enacts its right to alter or abolish those governments which do not perfect the law of nature in the way they see fit. And so they've disbanded the Articles of Confederation and they have adopted this new document, the Constitution of the United States. So the people remains the same, even if the government itself changes. So we have Article 1, which of course specifies the powers and duties of the legislative branch. We note, by the way, from our reading for today, that Madison, even in by writing the later and middle and late sections of the Federalist Papers, still maintained that the Constitution would be a legislatively dominated federal body. Article 2, as we know, establishes the powers and responsibilities of the executive branch. Article 3, not the Supreme Court. I'm sorry, Article 3 establishes the Supreme Court. As you know, it does not establish the power of judicial review, which would come later, but it does specify that the court shall exist and what sorts of things fall under the jurisdiction of that court and the various federal courts. Article 4, it has its major features include the so-called full faith and credit clause, which explains that your driver's license in South Carolina is good in Ohio. Likewise, your wills and deeds and last testaments and marriage licenses and all this kind of stuff. Likewise, the Privileges and Immunities Clause, which prevents you from essentially being tried in different states for the same crime. Um, Section 4 is an interesting one. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion. So the guarantee of the republican form of government has sometimes been invoked as a justification for intervention in state and local election procedures, which the federal government otherwise takes a very soft hand in. Article 5 here, the so-called Supremacy Clause, which establishes that between the state governments and the federal government, the law of the federal government and the law of the Constitution is the so-called law of the land. So it's superior or supreme to the state governments. Article 6, I'm sorry, actually, I just completely got that wrong. Article 5 does not include the Supremacy Clause. It's in Article 6. Article 5 proposes the amendment process. Article 6 proposes the Supremacy Clause and also takes care of the various debts and obligations that the states had incurred during the wartime efforts. And then Article 7 specifies the conditions for ratification. Then, as you know, there have been a series of amendments to the Constitution. So amendment means change. The first 10 amendments constitute the so-called Bill of Rights. Now, this Bill of Rights, these 10 amendments, which I think many people consider to be the backbone of the Constitution, or that part of the Constitution that people are most familiar with. These were sort of agreed on beforehand, submitted almost immediately upon ratification, and were ratified, and have been part of the documents since 1791. I'm not going to go over these one at a time. You know the Bill of Rights by now. The thing to note about the Bill of Rights is that it's a good example of what we mean when we say that liberalism is the political ideology of both limited government and individual rights. So if we think about what an individual right is, right, an individual right is a claim that we make against both our neighbors and against the government. And insofar as it's a claim that we make against the government, an individual right is a limit on the government. The very idea of individual rights suggests that government's power is limited. So, for example, in the First Amendment, we learn that Congress is prohibited from establishing a national church. Likewise, it's prohibited from stopping us from saying what we want to say unless certain conditions are met, et cetera, et cetera. And so these are themselves limits on the government. Congress cannot, in any way, shape, or form, establish a church. Likewise, Congress, and of course the court has interpreted this in a pretty broad sense, Congress and no other government official can stop you from speaking in the public sphere, provided you meet certain minimal conditions and these sorts of things. So individual rights are themselves limits on government. You can't have a limited government without individual rights, and you can have individual rights without limited government. With respect to the other amendments, the only one we should really pay attention to are amendments 13 and 14, eradication of slavery in the 13th Amendment, and then the 14th Amendment, which many have considered to be a kind of second constitutional founding, in the sense that it sort of reinterpreted the various constitutional promises to individuals in light of some of the abuses that were suffered in the pre-war era. I'm not going to say much more about it. I do want to discuss briefly what Madison has to say about it, and in particular what Madison has to say about the so-called separation of powers. We see him in 47, citing here the oracle, who is always consulted and cited on the subject, is a celebrated Montesquieu. So citing Montesquieu, again, Montesquieu's influence on the founders was immense. The spirit of the laws, they all would have been not just familiar with it, but it would have read it with great interest. and considered a kind of textbook for this great undertaking that they had begun. We see him in 47 arguing that one of the principal objections inculcated by the more respectable adversaries to the Constitution is its supposed violation of the political maxim that the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments ought to be separate and distinct. So we often say that the U.S. government features the separation of powers. But what Madison explains here is that in the United States, in the constitutional system, there is no separation of powers. What we have is something much closer to the intermingling of powers, which is to say that it's not as if, so, I mean, one way of thinking about this, we know that there are, as Locke described, right, three or four constitutional powers, that government can be understood in terms of three or four powers. We have, on the one hand, the legislative power, we have the judicial power, and we have the executive power, which some theorists, as we've noted, distinguish between, on the one hand, executing the law, and the other, participating in foreign policy. The American constitutional system combines these two things. The president does both. So one way of thinking about that is as well, there's three governmental powers: the executive function, the legislative function, the judicial function, and these go with the three branches. The president is in charge of the executive function. The legislative is in charge of the legislative function. The judicial is in charge of the judicial function. And we need to keep these as clean and separate as possible. But that's not really at all what Madison envisioned. For Madison, you don't want to keep these things separate. What you want to do is you want to give certain checks, as it were, certain powers, certain a kind of leverage upon each branch to the other branches. So, for example, the legislative branch has the legislative function. So, in other words, it writes law and it puts it into the hands of the executive, who enforces it. At the same time, the president has a legislative power. He has the veto power. That is a law-making power. It's at least a law-negating power. And of course, as we know, the judicial branch has the power, or at least over time, it had the power to review these laws and determine whether or not these laws are in keeping with the Constitution or are constitutional. Likewise with the executive branch. So we know that the president has the power to assemble a cabinet, those who will advise him and will carry out the day-to-day functions of the executive branch. But at the same time, you know that Congress has to approve these appointees. So Congress, in other words, has a kind of leverage power over the executive branch in this particular function. Likewise with the judicial branch. The executive function has a check on the judicial branch, namely it nominates the members of the bench, and the legislative branch has a check on the judicial branch, namely it confirms these appointments. So the idea isn't to separate these as cleanly as possible, and this is a charge that Madison is here answering. He says, yes, it's true, and he says in the next paragraph, no political truth is certainly of greater intrinsic value, or is stamped with the authority of more enlightened patrons of liberty, than that on which this objection is founded. The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elected, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. This he borrows directly from Montesquieu. We want to prevent the abuse of power, and we prevent the abuse of power by making sure that power has to answer to somebody, that power isn't unchecked, that it has limits on it, and that these limits are, in some sense, held in the hands of someone else. Now, if we jump down here to 51, 51 is, without question, the most well-known and probably the most momentous of these papers. He explains this idea of the intermingling of power, and more importantly, he gives us some insights into the theory of human nature that motivates Madison and the liberal constitutional project more generally. So here's what he says in 51. To what expedient, then, shall we finally resort for maintaining in practice the necessary partition of power among the several departments as laid down in the Constitution? The only answer that can be given is that as all these exterior provisions are found to be inadequate, the defect must be supplied by so contriving the interior structure of the government as that its several constituent parts may, by their mutual relations, be the means of keeping each other in their proper places. So the idea here is to create a kind of fine tuned machine in which the movements of one part will naturally check the movements of another part. And the reference here to a machine is actually pretty apt. So, if you know much about modernity in general, if you know much about the Enlightenment, and of course this is being written at around the, really the apex of the European Enlightenment, you know that the Enlightenment saw a number of scientific advances. And if we think about what science does, right, science attempts to explain an apparently infinite variety of natural occurrences through observation and then the discovery of underlying explanatory laws, right? So in other words, every tree is different, every blade of grass is different, every molecule of air is different, and yet every tree and every blade of grass was brought about, right? Is the end result was caused by a series of principles, a series of laws, which are always and already in effect, and they're in effect in a uniform fashion. Right. So if you can understand the laws of thermodynamics, for example, if we understand the laws of photosynthesis, if we understand the various laws that um, explain how large plants or animals grow based on how much nutrients they get, et cetera, et cetera. You can explain. You can say this tree is larger, or it has this shape, or it has this character, or it has this color because it gets too much of this or it gets too much of that. And we can trace all of this apparently infinite variety that we see around us back to a few fundamental and underlying mechanisms. And of course, in the 18th century, guys like Montesquieu and then guys like the constitutional, like our founders, thought that such a science could be performed in politics as well. That the apparently infinite variety of institutions and constitutions and the infinite variety of events and occurrences that we see in the social and political spheres could be traced back or could be understood in terms of certain fundamental underlying laws of social and political behavior. And of course, in the same way that natural science, the practical application of natural science is machines of various kinds. So engineering, applied science, right? If we understand thermodynamics better, then we can understand engines better, and we can understand how to produce engines through locomotion through steam, and we can eventually understand the battery and these sorts of things. Well, likewise, if we can understand the laws, the sort of laws of thermodynamics of social and political life, if we can understand these laws, then we can design machines, read constitutions, which effectively harness the powers of these natural forces that we see around us. And that's the idea here. The idea is to design a constitution which is subtle enough, which is nuanced enough, which is precise enough to harness certain fundamental principles and certain fundamental forces that we observe in the social and political branch. Now, what are those forces? Well, in the case of Madison, the force that he considers to be fundamental and the force that he thinks the Constitution is going to be able to harness is something like ambition. It's something like self-interest. Here's what he writes on 268. The great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments on the others. The provision for defense must in this, as in all other cases, be made commensurate to the danger of attack. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. Continuing on, it may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls and government would be necessary. Right? So the problem is that we require government because we're men, because we're fallen creatures. If we were perfect, if we were angels, we wouldn't require government, but we do, which means that some men will be called upon to rule other men. Now, the problem is that all men are fallen. No men are angels, which means that even those which are elected to office will require some checks. And so what force within those people, within those men, within those rulers, what force can you count on? Well, you can't count on them to be angels, so you can't count on their virtues. What you can count on is their ambition, which means You can make the ambition of one branch, you can make the jealousy they have for their own power, for their own constitutional rights and obligations, you can make that jealousy serve to check the attempts to accrue power in the other branches. So the assumption is that Congress will be jealous of its own power, and it won't want to cede any of this power to the executive branch, and it won't want to cede any of this power to the judicial branch. So you can rely, if you can't rely on them to uphold the Constitution from a virtuous love of country or something like that, what you can rely on is that they don't want to lose power. And so if you can contrive the mechanism in such a way to give the legislative branch the checks on the executive branch that it needs to keep the executive branch in place, and vice versa, each branch supplying through ambition, motivated by ambition, the checks necessary to limit each branch, then you really got something. Then what you do is you prevent tyranny, which is to say you prevent the accumulation in a single person or group of people of all of these powers. All right, I'll cut it short there, and we'll keep our discussions of liberalism going next time. Bye bye.